Welcome to Talks-Unfiltered, the podcast where we drink tea, we talk, and they're both unfiltered. My name is Jake, and I will be your host, and on today's episode, we will be drinking a Wudang white tea, and we're going to be discussing the circadian clock as determined by Chinese medicine. But first, welcome back everyone to another Tea Talk. Yeah, we're back with this series. The regular weekly releases will continue from this video on. So welcome back and thank you for tuning in. Today I wanted to start off the new series with a discussion on the circadian clock, the circadian rhythm. And really this is our natural daily energetic cycle of our body. Okay. And there are a lot of frameworks like this that we use not just in Chinese medicine and Taoism, but throughout Chinese culture in general, right? So everything from the lunar calendar to annual seasonal changes, 5 phases, any kind of numerology or feng shui, all of these systems are really a different framework to help us observe and understand our connection to our environment, our relationship, okay? And so I think that this is a really good place to start just because it's very essential. You know, it's something that obviously happens to us every single day. It's the easiest way for us to kind of tune in and listen to our bodies. And in that way, I hope, you know, we can prevent some problems before they become chronic issues, right? And so this is a good way to kind of look into the inner landscape of ourselves, physically, mentally, emotionally, and hopefully understand those signals and that feedback that we get and approach a better state of balance, right? Because essentially the system we're going to go through today is the ebb and flow of energy, of qi, throughout the different channels or meridians of the body, right? So as this changes throughout the day, we recognize certain patterns, we recognize certain kind of pieces of information. And hopefully by tuning into that, we can align ourselves for the most optimum conditions. So I hope that you have the time to join me for today's discussion. Cheers. Very nice. Okay, so a good, nice, subtle white tea to start off the new series. I hope you guys have some new fresh tea to enjoy for this talk. But yeah, let's get started. First off, I do want to preface the conversation by kind of explaining like why do we need to understand this system? You know, what is the usefulness of it? And I touched on that a little bit already, like becoming our first doctor, you know, becoming the listener, kind of being able to interpret some of those signals that we receive. I think that we've done ourselves a pretty big disservice in more recent years. And I think this is maybe just part of the human condition as well, is that we complicate a lot of things about ourselves and we specialize them. And that specialty, we give that responsibility to other people, which of course in some situations is necessary. Like there is a time for a physician, there's a time for a doctor and professional medical assistance. But I also think that there is a lot of kind of preventative measures that we can take just in paying attention, just in building our awareness, our sensitivity, things that we can do and recognize on our own, hopefully will diminish the need for extreme care, you know, because we're kind of dealing with anthills before they become mountains. So that's kind of my hope with this. I think this information should be common knowledge. You know, we're familiar with some terms. We're familiar with things like SAD, SAD, the seasonal affective disorder. And so we know that during the winter, when sunlight can be a rare commodity in some places, people tend to go through higher peaks of depression and kind of emotional imbalance because of that deficit of their kind of natural environment, you know, the vitamin D, the kind of nutrients that they're used to getting, that dependency in a way. Because of that change, that does affect us on an emotional level. It can affect you on a physical level. And we notice some of these connections through scientific research and also just through history and through, you know, our own experience. I hope that we can spread that awareness and kind of bring it into our daily lives, because nowadays there's so much that we've sacrificed in a way for our daily livelihood, for the schedule that is been implemented in modern society, and kind of become the necessary like platitude we place everything on, right? And so I hope that understanding this system will give you some insight into maybe a particular pattern or something that will help you get balanced a little bit better. Because humans, while we are extremely adaptable, sometimes that adaptation can be at a cost, right? And so we end up sacrificing sleep, we end up sacrificing diet, we end up sacrificing mental well-being. And I think that a lot of times small adjustments can make a really, really big difference. And so hopefully we'll go through this system. It is a schedule. It's kind of analyzed and broken down. But again, it is kind of a general guideline. I think that some of this stuff, when you get into the deeper levels of it, we start talking about the organs, we start about meridian lines, energetic chi flows, things like this. Yeah, we can get really, really precise. But I don't want to be diagnosing. I don't want to be prescribing. I want to be sharing information so that you can take something with that, coordinate your life with it in some way, and recognize a benefit, right? Because it's not necessarily that these are the way it has to be for everybody, right? There are differences. I think one of the things we have to remember when we're talking about all of these different, especially the Taoist, the Chinese kind of culture, systems of thought that have came up, whether it's philosophy or medicine or theory of some kind, these have been designed for this environment, right? And so there are adjustments that are made in the textbooks for different regions of, for example, China, the northern mountainous regions, the southern more tropical climates. There are adjustments made in the text for things like that, right? And so when we get into other frameworks and other theories, it can be pretty complicated because we're not only applying it to Chinese people in China, we're applying it to people from all over the world, different hemispheres, different time zones, different climates, not to mention the socioeconomic things that are at play. So I think that this can be a good guideline, and the circadian rhythm, the circadian clock, is very simple because it's very natural. It seems very universal to human, not necessarily just regional, right? And so I think that this is a good place to start, and I hope that it's something we can use to build upon our well-being. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I do need to introduce the Zang Fu. Okay, so we have the Zang Fu, Zangfu. Okay, so we have two different types of organs, right? We have 12 to be in total, so 6 Zang and 6 Fu, okay? And so the Zang are the major organs. These are the ones that we're going to talk about predominantly most of the time. All the time we're discussing these. The Fu are kind of the assistant organs, okay? So Zang are yin, solid organs, okay? The Fu are yang, hollow organs. And so when we talk about the organs, we talk about these different things, the main thing to remember is we're talking about a network, okay? We're not necessarily just talking about the anatomical singular organ. So if we talk about the heart, we don't mean just the heart. We mean the connective tissue. We mean the system that's built around it. And that doesn't really have to mean exactly the physical representation of what the heart is. That we describe to it now. I like to think of it more as a network, as a connection, as kind of the influence of the heart throughout the body. Okay, because we're talking about more than just its anatomical location. We're talking about its function. We're talking about its influence on the rest of the landscape of the body. Okay, so we have the 6 Zang, yin organs, which are the liver, the heart, the lungs, the spleen, and the kidneys and the pericardium. Yes. Then for the Fu, we have the gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, stomach, triple burner. Okay. And bladder. I missed one. And so we'll go through those. Each one is paired together. So we typically have we do have the liver is paired with the gallbladder. The heart is paired with the small intestine. The spleen is paired with the stomach, lungs with the large intestine, kidneys with the bladder, and then the pericardium is connected with the triple burner. And we'll get to those. Those are kind of like the two specials, okay? We normally talk about the 5 major ones that I mentioned first, okay? They each have an assistant, so we'll focus on those. But the really great thing about the circadian clock is that with 12 meridians, 12 different organs, 12 channels, we have 24 hours in the day, and the day is split into 12 2-hour sections. So as we go through the clock, basically every 2-hour piece is dedicated where a certain organ is at its kind of energetic climax of the day. Okay, so when it's at its most capable period. Okay, so when it's in effect. And that doesn't mean that it's shut off during the other times of the day, but there are kind of that rising and diminishing energetic level. Okay, so one of the ways that I think about it is when we talk about meridian channels, we're really talking about the kind of change of the tide. Okay, so there's a lot of references to the sun and the moon, specifically to the moon, because we're talking about yin energy, and that has a more direct influence on the daily cycle, right? The sun, the yang energy, that is what creates all life, but then the influence on that life, we can see in kind of the distance and the ebb and flow of the moon, of the yin energies. Okay, so when we talk about this, it's nice to kind of think of it like that, of kind of the tide coming in and going out. And we have that building energy and that sinking energy, okay? And so throughout the day, there's always going to be water, there's always going to be activity, but there is kind of a building point. There is a high tide and there is a low tide, okay? So you can think of these periods, these 2-hour sections of the clock throughout the day as being the high tide for that specific pier, that specific organ, okay? And that kind of lets you understand, okay, now we're discussing that one. That's kind of when it's most essential, and potentially that would be the period of time to pay attention to for specific patterns of imbalance or ways to approach that balance, okay? So we'll break it down and go through the full day like this. Okay. And then the only other thing to mention before we get into it is that the order does go from major to secondary, and then when it changes periods again, then it goes to another secondary and then to a major. And so it's kind of a neat way of memorizing the list, is that we start with a major Zang organ, then we go into their assistant Fu organ, and then the Fu organ cannot transition into a major organ. It transitions to another assistant, and that assistant translates to a major, the major goes to a major, the major goes to an assistant. And so it's kind of a nice way, like this handshake that happens throughout the day. So if you remember the connections, if you remember the two that are together, then you remember just one handshake, then you kind of can do the cycle pretty quickly. It's a pretty intuitive system once we get into it. Okay, so just kind of remember that we kind of go through the full cycle in 12 sections, and then we repeat the system. We have a new day. So, let's get started. Real quick before I get into it, because it's going to be a bunch of information. If this is something that you find very interesting, and today's talk makes you more curious about this information, about some of these different systems of thought, please do join us at the Ways of Wudang Discord channel. There are links in the description of this video on YouTube, but you can also go on Discord. You can search for it, the Ways of Wudang or the Wudang community. So that's completely free. You can join in and you can connect with other people who are practicing. I post resources that I share in these videos and things like that. So there's always a discussion happening there. You're more than welcome to join us and continue this tea talk in another format. So hope to see you there. And if you're really interested in Chinese theory, medical theory, philosophy, music, there are a lot of resources there, and I'm staying active and kind of publishing as much as I can to share with you guys. So I hope these talks benefit your practice, but there are always more layers to uncover. So the Ways of Wudang on Discord, you can find that through the website, or you can search for that online in the link below. So thank you. All right, so now we get into the schedule, and we're going to start off with the beginning of the day. We're going to start off real simple at 1 to 3 a.m. Okay, so first thing in the morning, even though you're asleep, the energetic cycle is still continuing, right? It doesn't ever just stop. As long as you're alive, the system is always replenishing, restoring, exchanging, and transforming. Okay, so 1 to 3 a.m., the first organ we start with is the liver. Okay, so the liver is a wood phase organ. It is a major organ. It is a Zang, which means it is a yin and a solid organ. Okay, its function is to stay full. It doesn't want to transport like a Fu. A Fu organ will transport, and it always wants to be empty. It's trying to, kind of excrete or transform or transport whatever it creates. It doesn't create anything, but it tries to just get rid of all the things that it has. Okay, with these Zang, these yin organs, they're solid. They're typically producing something. They have a very important function, a primary function of the body. And so the liver, its function is to ensure the smooth flow of qi and blood throughout the body. Okay, so it's kind of replenishing. It's detoxing the blood. It's replenishing the stores. It's getting everything recovered and ready to go. Okay, so if we think of 1 to 3 a.m. in the morning, this is the detox and recovery period. This is our deep sleep. Okay, this is also, the liver is considered the general of the body, which makes the liver responsible for planning and making big decisions. Okay, now this seems like a weird thing to point out in the circadian clock because it's 1 to 3 in the morning, and hopefully you're not making any big decisions in the middle of your sleep, right? This is what we think about. But I also like to think that this is kind of when your body does its most kind of intuitive planning, right? This is when your mind returns to its center. Okay, this is when your intention kind of settles. This is when things kind of form, ideas come to mind. If everyone's ever had a late night and then they can't find themselves going to sleep because their mind is too active, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's kind of similar in a way of that, this is when your body's trying to make decisions. And if you're awake for it, it can be pretty distracting. So the liver is the general in charge of this decision making. And I think it happens at night because I like this idea of, we've kind of made our decisions already, and we're working throughout our life to understand kind of why we've made those decisions, right? And so while we're not necessarily writing out a flow chart and doing this kind of to-do list in our mind, we are returning to some kind of balance, some kind of center, so that we can make good decisions throughout the rest of the day. Anyone who's ever had a really bad day of sleep, a really bad night of sleep, and woken up in the middle of the night, probably around 3 a.m., with just racing thoughts, and then not been able to really function at a high level for the rest of the day in your decision making or otherwise, I think that's kind of due to an excessive liver, right? That could be this anxiety that's building up, and that's when this emotion will strike, right? That's when anger, anxiety, and this kind of indecisiveness can happen. This 1 to 3 period is really important because it's just kind of the idea of we're returning to our center. We kind of have the general. He's going back to, check the status of his troops, build up the stores of the military and kind of prepare for the next day, the next battle, right? And so this preparation is even more important than, what happens throughout the day. Because without preparation, the battle's lost before it started, right? What's the phrase is that the war was lost for want of a horseshoe, for want of a nail, because the nail wasn't prepared correctly, and the horseshoe didn't fit the horse, and the horse that the general rode, stumbled and fell, and the signals couldn't go to the troops, and the troops didn't know the plan of action, and the plan of action didn't get taken forth, so the battle was lost. The battle was lost, and it was the most important, so the war was lost. And you have this kind of idea of, the war was lost for want of a nail. And I think that idea of the liver being this decision-making kind of planning and preparation for the day. I think that's a really good idea. And I think that that's maybe one of the most common areas where people have anxiety about sleep is waking up super early in the morning. It might not be that you have insomnia, that you're not able to fall asleep. That could be another issue. But there is this idea of people falling asleep and then just getting a few hours and waking up and just being wide awake all night. And that can be a very kind of anxious period. It can be kind of coupled with a lot of anger, which is the emotion of the liver, that kind of hot blood, that short temper. And so all of these imbalances that happen will happen 1 to 3. And that deep sleep, that recovery period, the detox and kind of smooth flow of blood won't happen, right? And will kind of offset the rest of the day. So the liver is a very, very important organ. And we start there first thing in the morning. Okay. The next organ, so like I said, from one Zang, we go to another Zang. So when we trade, now we move from the wood phase. We don't move in the same system like a generating cycle of wood, fire, earth, metal, water. We actually go from here, from the wood phase, we go into a metal phase. Okay, so the wood phase is talking about growth. So again, like I talk about recovery, it's kind of, the sprout of the day is beginning to be cultivated. Now we're actually moving into a metal phase, which isn't generative cycle. We don't have to worry about this. But the next one, from 3 to 5, is the Zang organ, the yin organ of the lungs. Okay, so from one Zang to another Zang, moving into the metal phase. Now, if you look at the liver period as being the kind of preparation of the body, I look at the metal as kind of the preparation of the mind, right? It is that period where now we're analyzing, the metal phase is all about logic. And now we've already achieved that kind of deep sleep. And now we're into the memory cleansing. We're into the mental cleansing. We're into deep sleep with dreams. Okay, so this is that 3 to 5 period. This is, right before you're waking up. Maybe you're waking up sometime towards the end of this period, but you're having those kind of those detoxing of the mind, right? And so this is a really unique part of the day, a really, really clear one. Always when we talk about lungs, it's always very, very clear how it's related to the lungs, because it's always a direct path, right? The lungs are one of the few organs that we have kind of a conscious control over, where we can stop, we can change, we can increase, we can do lots of things to affect our state of breathing and directly the function of the lungs, right? And because of this, it's interesting, because I think at this period is when we have no control, is when everything is kind of let go, which is the essential kind of detail of the lungs, is letting go. And not in a free fall state, but kind of in this period where now everything comes to the surface. What's not necessary becomes removed, which is kind of the idea with a lot of dreams in Taoism. Is we talk about how the dreams that come to your mind are kind of the flash through of images, of thoughts, of your body and your mind kind of cleaning information that's not necessary. And sometimes those connections that are being kind of filtered through, and kind of the Rolodex of thoughts is being, adjusted. During that period, your mind is kind of seeing those pictures, those images, those connections, and trying to create a storyline. And it connects them into what we perceive as a dream, right? And that's kind of the simple answer for what we look at dreams being. In not all perspectives, of course, there are many different interpretations, but I think the general consensus is that, it's the mind kind of going through and filtering out information from short-term or long-term memory of some sort that's not necessary anymore. And so it's kind of cleansing. And during that period, because your metal phase is very tied to logic and analyzing and kind of protection and things like that, it's going through that, and it's trying to understand the pattern, even though there might not be a pattern, right? And so we get dreams. This is also when we detox the breath. So we get to our most deep breathing, okay, optimally. Of course, during this period, this might be when people have sleep apnea, snoring. This might be, some kind of imbalance, deficiency of breath control of ability. And so this is when it'll be most apparent, waking up without being rested, waking up abruptly in a state of emotional distress of some kind, grief attacking you before you wake up. That's also tied to the metal phase, to the lungs. And so having any kind of restrictive feeling during this part of the day is a negative signal, right? That's a feedback that's telling you that there's some kind of problem with this channel, okay, with the channel of the lungs. And so hopefully this is when we get to our deepest sleep with dreams, cleansing the mind, cleaning the breath, and waking up warm, because the lungs have to do with the kind of the dispersion and what do you call it? The not expansion, but in a way the dissemination of energy and chi throughout the body. So energy sinks and disperses, right? So descending and dispersing. That's what the lungs are in charge of. And so this has to do with the space between the skin and the muscles, having that kind of area being warm, being more fluid. So having like dry skin when you wake up, that is a sign of deficiency. Having sweaty hands and sweaty body when you wake up, that's a sign of excessiveness and some kind of maybe stagnant energy somewhere. And so you want to have open and warm and relaxed, right? And so your body is kind of getting all the way settled down. So when you wake up, you're balanced, right? The liver houses the hun, which is the ethereal soul. Is kind of there are three of them, but basically we're talking about the kind of intangible self, right? The part of you that makes you that's not physical, right? So the lungs house the seven po, which are the corporal, the physical souls, right? And so these have to do with kind of the different energies of the body. And so when you die, these are the ones that kind of disperse over the course of a week, right? And return to nature. And so we think first we kind of settle that root soul, the kind of intangible version of ourselves. And then the lungs come around, the metal phase, and then we root that physical self and connect those 3 hun and 7 po together. And then when everything's kind of working in synchronicity with each other, then that allows you kind of to fully recover, fully replenish, and return to your source. So that way when you open your eyes at the end of the lungs, or sometime during the large intestine period, between 5 and 7 hopefully, you're ready to go. Okay, so that's kind of the end of the day, beginning of the morning detox. Okay, then, like I mentioned, then we get into 5 to 7 a.m., which is the paired fu with the lungs, the large intestine. Okay, now again, this one seems pretty intuitive. You wake up, the second half of the metal and the lungs to large intestine kind of function. Their second task is the task of elimination. And so we think about excretion, bowel movements, waking up, dryness, things like this. This is when those become very important, right? So you wake up and you have kind of water release, you have bowel release. There should be some kind of replenishing of water in the body as well. So the best system that we use here is when you wake up, you have a warm glass of a warm glass of water. You don't need tea this early in the morning, but just a warm glass of water, to get you set up for the day. And then you probably have a visit to the bathroom, right? And this is actually really important because the metal phase is kind of ruled by dryness, okay? And so that means we're just more aware of the level of dryness, right? If it's too extreme, that can be a bad thing. That can be a sign of fire or weakness of some kind of deficiency. But because of that connection to dryness during this period of the day, we should be kind of replenishing the water stores if they are low, but we should also be observing the kind of natural tendency we have. If you wake up with dry eyes, that's a big sign for a liver or a lung imbalance, because the liver does open up in the eyes. So you think about you're closing your eyes, you're kind of replenishing, restoring the fluid, the ability, the function, the quality of the eyes. And with the lungs, you're kind of distributing that energy throughout the body, right? So if you wake up with dry, red eyes, if you wake up with a dry mouth, if you wake up not having to go to the bathroom, or not thirsty, and you still have a feeling of fullness, then that can be a sign of excessive in some state. Probably eating too late the night before, not enough rest, staying up too late. There are many different causes, but I think the signal you should be looking for in the morning is that level of dryness, the ability to let go in the morning. And so letting go is kind of the purpose of the metal phase, right? And that has to do with everything on a physical, a mental, and an emotional level, right? And so letting go in the morning is literally excreting, it is getting rid of, it is waste management. But that also applies to the mental and emotional self. So I think that letting go, this is why when we talk about dreams in Taoism, there isn't always a lot of information about it, because it is kind of seen as one of those things of, okay, your body is eliminating, your mind is eliminating, and removing, letting go. And so it becomes, observing those kind of tendencies and those stories that play out, but also not becoming attached to them. They're just patterns, but there's something that you kind of observe, perceive, analyze as much as you need to, and then you let go of them and you move on. And so that's kind of the balance between, memory and nostalgia, right? There's a difference in kind of observing the past and living in it, right? And so grief is one of those things that this 3 a.m. to 7, in the morning, this period of time, grief is one of those things that doesn't let you leave that period of the day, right? It keeps you in bed, it holds you back, it slows you down, it doesn't let you let go of things, right? And so because grief is that emotion that has to deal with the metal phase, it is the antithesis to letting go, right? And so again, we apply these principles to our physical selves just as well as our emotional and spiritual selves. So large intestine, let go, very important. Also a really great time of day to check the qualities of the body. I'm talking about checking the dryness, the skin, of the eyes, of the mouth, of course. I think that this is also the best period of time to do other observational checks. Like, if you're looking at body weight, this is when your water weight is the lowest of the day. So it's the most true sense of if you're looking for lean muscle mass. But also if you're doing any kind of pulse diagnosis, or if you're checking your tongue, looking at the luster of your face, checking your complexion, all of these things, everything in the morning is analyzing, right? So we analyze and then we let go. So we have to kind of understand these patterns and then do our best to kind of prepare for the best option. Okay. So again, liver, set the rules, kind of decide what we're going to do for the rest of the day. And now we get to eliminate, kind of remove the easy tasks, get ourselves ready and take the store of what we really have. What's the quality of our sword for the rest of the day? You got to clean the blade, you got to sharpen it, and you got to make sure that you're not carrying around any excess weight. So, that is the lungs and large intestine. Okay. So the morning goes pretty easily. It's pretty straightforward. Once we go from the large intestine from 5 to 7, we move into 7 to 9, which is the stomach. Okay. So again, one food organ to another food organ. Okay, the stomach is a secondary organ. Its goal is to be empty, right? And so it does take in things, but its purpose is to continually to digest in this case and to remove whatever you put inside it, right? That is its goal. It's not meant to hold on to things. Okay, so now we move into the earth phase with the stomach. And this is, again, one of the real easy ones. We can just look at the stomach and just think, okay, the 7 to 9, this is breakfast. So we wake up, we do our light practice, we kind of get set up for the day, detox, have our visit to the bathroom, and now we have our first meal. Once we're cleaned up and ready to go, 7 to 9, we have breakfast. Earth, again, this is always talking about harvest. This is talking about your abundance. This is talking about the kind of the caring nature of the earth. And so we tie the stomach with that very, very clearly, right? It is directly attached to that. This is also the time of the day that concentration should be at its highest. That 7 to 9, of course, the stomach, and the next period of time from 9 to 11 is the spleen, which is the primary Zang of this relationship. The kind of state of mind at play here is clarity of mind, clarity of thought. Okay, and so hopefully we don't have any anxious feelings at this time, any kind of anxiety popping up. That is the kind of barrier at this time of day. Is even though we've kind of gotten rid of our fear and everything, gotten out of bed, now we have to have our plan. We have to have our ability to concentrate and get work done, right? This 7 to 9, we get our kind of light exercise done. We get our day set up. Everything should be kind of still settling in the day. So we have like this descending chi still taking place from the lungs and the large intestine. So it's kind of rooted and sunk down. And if you have any kind of like bad breath, acid reflux, indigestion of some kind, that can be a clear indicator that this is not a balanced state, and you should be returning to more light variety in your diet, something that gets the fire of the body going, but allows you to stay concentrated. So sometimes we say the breakfast is the biggest meal of the day, but a better idea would be it's the most hearty, it's the most kind of dense in nutrients, but quick to digest. Okay. So we're having lots of fruits, we're having soups, we're having noodles, we're having these kind of big warm meals. So that way we can keep going. It's not something that's so heavy that's weighing us down like a lunch meal where we're having a rest afterwards and taking a siesta. No, this is the period where we have that kind of like fuel for the day. Okay. And so 7 to 9, dealing with the stomach, this is the most intuitive, super clear. We just want to get everything moving. Okay. So light exercise, get everything going. We talk about the spleen and the stomach. The stomach prefers to be wet and is, averts itself away from dryness. And the spleen is the opposite. Okay. So the spleen likes dryness and it doesn't like dampness. Okay. So in the morning we have, at 7 to 9 period, we have a lot of liquids. We have soups. Typically here we have noodles as well. So we have all these kind of like lots of liquids. And then once we get into 9 to 11 with the spleen, it's dry, right? So we don't typically have any more meals. If we kind of pack any more weight on the kind of digestive fire at that time of day, it kind of just dampens everything. It brings the energy level down. Anything during here, this is when you're moving. This is when you get your most work done. Okay, so we move into 9 to 11 with the spleen. Okay, like I said, this is the concentrating period of the day, potentially the most concentrated part of the day. You want to have that clarity of mind. You want to have clear digestion. You want to have your best energy during 9 to 11. Probably the most amount of work will get done during this period. Okay, and so this part of the earth phase is about replenishing, right? This is about kind of harvesting and working the garden. So a direct metaphor we can use there. With the spleen, we're talking about the connection here having to do with the muscles of the body. So this is how we can see that's when we get the most work done. And that can mean like, in your job, whether that's, something that's not as active. But I think that's why we just say, the most active part of the day. Of course, exercise is what we as humans are conditioned for, because most of our history has been very active, right? And so work has been something that's been very physically demanding. And so it makes sense, 9 to 11, it's not the peak of the day where it's the most hot and where we kind of have to be careful of burning out or dehydration or things like this. It's that morning where it's not cold, the sun's out, you're active and you're getting things done. So it makes sense that our body is kind of coinciding with that. And the spleen, keep pluralizing every single organ, is directly connected to the capability of the muscles, right? And so that kind of physical strength and endurance of the body. Of course, now we apply that more in loose terms because some of the work that we do is office work. It's much more management based. It might not be as physically tolling, but even then, the brain is the biggest muscle. So we are still doing a lot of demanding work. And so it's important that we have clarity of thought. It's important that we have no distractions, whether that's physical or mental or emotional. And so 9 to 11, we get everything done. We like to be cool and dry during this period, but we like to get a lot of work done. Okay, so if you're doing any kind of practices, if you're doing any kind of large undertakings, 9 to 11 is the best time to plan it. It's probably when you're going to be the most clear, maybe not the most decisive, but if you have a plan put in place from before, it's very easy for you to kind of accomplish tasks and knock off pieces on your to-do list. So 9 to 11, always make sure that this part is a focused part of your day. Okay. Then we move into the next Zang organ of the heart from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Now, the heart is very, very special because the heart is the home of the Shen, or the spirit of the body. Okay, so this is kind of the king, the monarch, the leader of the self. Okay, and so I said before, the liver is kind of the decision maker, and I think maybe a better phrasing would actually be it is the kind of the one that takes action on decisions. But decisions truly come from the heart. It is the one that really makes the final say-so and decides whether or not such and such will happen. And this is something I think is really important, and something that we've observed a lot more now is that while we like to think that we perceive and we make decisions responsibly and logically with our mind by analyzing and creating flowcharts of pros and cons and weighing the options, when it really comes down to it, that final reactionary decision that we make is from the heart, and from there we will perceive a very big series of connections and logical justifications or fallacies for making that decision with our mind, right? So we will decide to eat a candy bar or do something to relax or do a certain job, career, accomplishment, task. But in the end, it comes down to the heart of kind of saying, yes, we're going to do that, and then your mind will make up a justification. Well, I trained all week, I deserve a Snickers bar. And so that decision making really happens in the heart. It might be the liver that's kind of carrying it out, kind of the general of the orders, so to say. But there is only one king, right? And that is the heart from 11 to 1. And this phase is the fire phase. Okay, so this is the most active. This is, of course, we're getting into that peak part of the day, the afternoon, the noon period. And so you can see the energies kind of rising up. They're at their peak in energy. And so it makes sense that we attribute that to the fire phase. Okay. This period has to do with enjoyment. It has to do with happiness is the emotion, which every time we talk about the emotions, we are talking about negative desires most often, right? We're talking about imbalances. We're talking about the internal evils in some cases, right? So what they're termed as. And the reason happiness is in there, which I think sometimes maybe a better term for the extreme situations of it would be desire. Because for English, that sounds more kind of negatively influencing rather than happiness. Happiness it always seems like that's kind of the purpose, right? That's always the goal, the destination. But in Chinese medical theory, happiness is seen as kind of the root of desire. It is seen as kind of this disturbance from the natural path, right? Because we're not doing things for the sake of being pleased or rewarded. We're doing them because it promotes growth, because it's the only thing that's right to do, right? That seems a little cynical on some levels if you look at it too deeply, but I think that's why we need to look at happiness more as like this desire, right? And so a more balanced version of that would be contentness or enjoyment, right? And so we have not this extreme kind of like drive to find the happiness in everything we do. We're actually kind of not settling, but we're working towards something that is promoting growth, that establishes this contentness and this enjoyment, right? It becomes effortless, right? And so 11-1, I think if we look at it we look at it as this period of effortlessness, then it makes more sense that this is when we should start to relax the tension and take away some of the responsibility of the day, right? And so while the heart is in charge of making decisions, it can't be overburdened, right? It cannot be kind of just forced to do its job. You can't force the king to do his job, basically. There's no one higher than him, and the moment that you start to make rules and distinguishes and justifications and kind of trying to frame and cage the decision-making ability of the heart it instantly does something else just to spite you, right? And so it's kind of the idea of any practice, especially internal practice, for example, when we say, don't think about such and such, or don't think in general, you instantly start thinking, right? And that's kind of the reactionary force of the heart, right? It is this thing that it cannot be contained. The spirit, the Shen, it cannot be forced into cooperation, right? One of the things that we talk about is with the monkey mind, right? And everyone's familiar with this term. If you've made it this far in this conversation, the monkey mind is kind of the thing that drives and disturbs and distracts and creates thought. And it always kind of pulls you away from yourself. And so there's a lot of great stories about the monkey mind and how to tame it. But I still come back to Master Yuan's story. I have to credit him. I know that there's other places that this has come out. It's probably not new information, but it is a really great way of looking at it, because we like to visualize these stories, and they help us understand kind of, how we mediate disturbances and distractions, right? And so with the monkey mind, it's a nice image. It's a nice kind of story to help us understand that, we have this piece of ourselves that's always jumping from subject to subject and from branch to branch and moving around and kind of this wild, chaotic energy that the moment you try to contain it, the harder it fights back. And you have this kind of, this like teenage monkey in your mind that just continues to bang cymbals all over the place and just run amok. And we have the stories about, trying to give the monkey a banana. So that's kind of the discipline. That's kind of you doing mantra or doing a specific exercise of some sort to kind of create a pattern that the monkey can focus on and that can hold its attention, right? And this is a form, a method of cooperation, is a method of kind of compromise. But I like the words that Master Yen uses when we talk about, instead of trying to give the monkey a banana, as soon as the banana is gone, the monkey runs away again to play even more, because now it has more energy. Like you have the kids here and we train them to do, frog jumps and mabu and lots of forms and run around. And then you think, okay, they're disciplined, but actually you're just training them to be more intense. So now they just have more energy to run crazy. Instead of doing this banana exercise of some kind, discipline, instead we should kind of cultivate and restore the energy of the tree, of the heart, of the Shen. And so by restoring the energy, by kind of replenishing this central tree, the tree will bloom and it will grow its own bananas. And the monkey will sit down in the shade and feast. And it won't need to run around like crazy because it has everything it needs right here. And so I think that metaphor is something that we should apply to this period of the day. 11 to 1 with the heart. This is kind of the goal, right? We don't want to enforce discipline, especially during this period. In general, I think it's also a good tool, but especially during this period because we want to replenish the energy. We want to return to our center. We want to quiet down. And then the monkey mind will return of its own accord. It'll come back, it'll rest, it'll sit undisturbed and not create chaos, right? Because it has a comfortable home. So this is also kind of, if you're going through the 5-phase theory, if you're going through the 5 animal qigong, this is why fire phase having to do with the heart is always really important for this specific idea, talking about balance, talking about kind of returning the spirit to its home. Right? If you make the home comfortable and welcoming, then the spirit comes back. It's untroubled and it comes back on its own. It's not something that we can reach out and force into submission, right? That'll only make its will stronger. So during this 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Period, it's very important that we create that environment that allows you to relax. It allows you to rest and kind of correct the circulation, the energy flows of the body, right? Because the heart is in charge of the blood. It's in charge of the circulation. It's in charge of the basic communication throughout the body. And so when the leader is happy, when the spirit is comfortable and sitting underneath the shade, it makes good decisions. It makes sure that it's taking care of itself so that it can also be a service to the people, right? And so this leader, this king of the empire metaphor is very often used because we are products of our environment. We can see this in nature. We can see this in the animal kingdom. We can see this in society. We can see this in our body as well, right? The more at ease the heart is, the more comfortable all of its disciples are, right? All the other organs. Because they have a leader that they can follow, that they can trust. And it's not taking advantage of the relationship, right? You're not taking your responsibility of the spleen and the kind of driving force of the liver and putting all that decision making into the heart as well, and creating all this stress and worry and taking away any happiness or contentment that you might have. You're diminishing the spirit, the king of the empire. You're diminishing their ability to, have control or to make decisions. And so 11 to 1, this is the great time for us to have a good meal with family, to have a rest, to meditate, to do some light self-practice, something that, is a way that you can take care of yourself. So that way you're not burning all of your energy out in the middle of the day, right? So, don't burn the candle all the way through. This is kind of the middle of the day. You have to check it. If you're not using it, you can kind of put it to the side. You have your job, you have your career, you have your workflow. there is kind of a period of taking a break, separating from that, and having time to take care of yourself as well. Okay. So 11 to 1 p.m. for the heart. The assistant organ for the heart is at 1 to 3 p.m., and that is the small intestine. Okay. The small intestine carries over the duties of the heart, of the fire phase, with relaxation, kind of preparing for duty and responsibility to come back in, but also kind of delegating some work away. Okay, so small intestine is in charge of kind of transporting some of those basic waste products that are coming up halfway through the day, distributing them to, if it's a food-based thing, distributing that to the large intestine to take care of, or delegating fluid retention to the bladder, any kind of good nutrients, any of that work that's been harvested during the spleen and stomach periods of the early part of the day, any of that energy, the nutrients that have been created, those are distributed throughout the blood and through the rest of the body. And so the small intestine is kind of the delegation of the king of the heart. So it's kind of taking care of all of those light tasks, the midday infrastructure that needs to take place. This is a good time for us to have a short rest, potentially having a nap at some point in this time of the day. The siesta, again, is a very natural thing, because at the peak of the day, at the most yang period of the day, if you look at the Taiji circle, at that point of the day, we have a point of yin energy. So at its extreme, it inverts, right? And so we have to make sure that we do keep that balance, because if not, we burn everything out. And so 1 to 3 p.m., anyone who's worked an 8-hour anything, school, job, career, anything, knows that 2 to 3 is the longest hour of the day. And that is often because we've kind of forced this new schedule upon ourselves that, for all senses, is not too natural. I think this is pretty common knowledge now, that the 8-hour work week is a modern invention in response to wartime, historical things there. But in general, it's just this way of prioritizing manufacturing and industry, but sacrificing one's well-being. Energy cannot be created or lost. And I think that we're creating energy for this task, but we're taking the energy from ourselves to feed that. Okay. And so again, 1 to 3 is that light delegation. It's still a relaxing period of the day, but because we don't really have the option to have this schedule in modern society, this is often when we're faced with the biggest burnout of the day, is during the small intestine. And we don't get a lot of those delegations of the self, whether it's the physical kind of needs or it's the emotional needs. We don't really have a lot of time to take a nap or to do some light reading or to meditate in order to kind of get that balance in the middle of the day. So again, this cycle is not going to be something that we can always just conform to, right, and implement in our lives. But I think it's important to just know that connection and be wary of it. Hopefully there's a way that even if you have a 8-hour work schedule and that has to take place during this 9 to 5, 7 to 3, whatever it is, just be wary of this period of the day that energy is going to be lower. If there's a way for you to plan major tasks for the early morning instead of the afternoon, create the afternoon as more of a delegation. This can be your period of planning for the rest of the day or for the rest of the week. This can be the period of kind of checking off smaller tasks. You take care of the major work in the morning. You can do some light work now, if it's not optional to change it to another part of the day. But that'll allow you to kind of get more energy out of it generally, right? You're not going to diminish yourself and burn the candle down to the base. You will be able to avoid that burnout. Okay, so The 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., the fire phase, is very, very important to kind of stay balanced, because fire is I always like to say that, humans are the fire nation. And we are the ones that create all the trouble, whether that's for our environment or for ourselves. We have a tendency of burning. We have a tendency of creating, and we are fueled by compassion and happiness. And that is kind of the human potential, right? We have this ability for creation, and we have this taste of art, and we have this appreciation of these finer things in some way. But we're also very, very susceptible to our own weaknesses, our own drive, our own dependence on those things. And because of that, we often overextend ourselves. We often burn too bright, and we often, burn out because of that. And so this fire phase, I think, is really, really important for everyone, because we really do have that tendency. If you give someone a chart of the 5 phases and you say, which one do you identify more? Do you identify more with anxiety or grief or fear or, anger or happiness? Most people feel kind of pulled towards happiness initially. Like when you see that, you're like, well, I want to be more with happiness, right? We all have the right to the pursuit of happiness, right? It's ingrained in our bones that we're looking for this. Purpose is often not necessarily kind of interpreted as, but I do think that it definitely coincides. It definitely coincides with happiness, right? Your purpose creates happiness, right? And I think we have to understand that one comes before the other, right? And so if you want to be the best musician in the world or the best at anything, that purpose comes before happiness, right? The discipline, the work, that effort comes before the actual happiness arrives, right? And so we do need to make sure we take care of this decision making. We do need to make sure that we delegate work and that we kind of take care of ourselves along the way so that we can achieve that actual happiness and not just kind of perceive it as being, I'm doing the thing that I like and so I'm happy. That's not always the case. It's not a linear path. It's a change every day. So be wary of burnout during this period of the day. That's my final piece of advice. Okay, then from the small intestine, 1 to 3 p.m., we go into the bladder at 3 to 5 p.m. So bladder 3 to 5 p.m. and then at 5 to 7, moving into the kidneys. Okay, so this is the water phase. This is when we're talking about now that we haven't burned out, now we're replenishing the water in the body. Either way, even though we didn't burn out, more so if we did, we have to kind of bring the water levels back up because we just burned everything out, right? We used everything we had for the day, and now we have to make sure that we're not going to use our reserves. We're not going to use our second wind if we don't need to, right? And so 3 to 5, 5 to 7, this is water phase, starting with the bladder and the kidneys. Pretty clear to see water phase if you're thinking about the bladder, because that's our waste management. That's the liquid waste. This is when, you're getting home, everything's relaxing. You're kind of getting into that descending energy of the day. And so you're getting into that yin energy. And so this is the reserves, right? The bladder is kind of that light restoration, getting water back, starting to have an appetite manifest because of that thirst. I think that a lot of times we have to make sure that we're checking the water levels before we're creating a meal plan, because oftentimes appetite is more attached to our water level and our thirst rather than our actual hunger, right? And so this is an important thing, actually, like in the halfway part of the day, making sure that you have a good amount of liquids that you're drinking, because oftentimes we won't drink many liquids during the midday, during that fire period and during the first of the water phase. And then when we get to our meal in the evening, we tend to overconsume because we're actually not as hungry as we think. We have a bigger appetite, which are two different things, right? The appetite can be satiated quite a bit by drinking, by your thirst controls a lot of your appetite. And so if we have a better water balance in the body, we might realize we don't have as big of an appetite, and we're not actually as hungry as we think we are. The eyes are the same size as the meal, hopefully, which is not always the case. And so it's very important to kind of check these reserves, right? When we talk about the kidneys, we talk about the energy jing that's stored, which is very loosely translated, we'll often call it the vitality or the essence of the self, and the physical self, and the emotional and physical and mental as well. But the physical self, the jing, you can kind of look at it as being your kind of your reserve energy in some case, and those are kind of the pure energy that we're born with, and you don't want to use that. It's kind of like a limited cup, right? And you only have so much of it. We have to clean it and check it and maintain it, but we don't want to burn through it because it's a limited store in one way of thinking, right? Keeping it simple for now. But the kidneys and the bladder have to do with this water level. So making sure that that's at a good level during this part of the day is very important. This is our deep restoration is starting to begin. We're having our family dinner. We're taking care of any of our kind of our own practices, our own hobbies. We're kind of getting into our comfort zone, right? Because this time of day is the fear. The water phase has to do with the fright and the fear. And so if you're the opposite time of day, if you're wetting the bed or waking up dry, or if you're not able to wake up, then that's an imbalance with the kidneys and the urinary bladder, right? Because that has to do with fear, that has to do with water retention, and those directly impact the early morning experience as well. Because you think about if one time of the day is its peak, then the opposite time period will be its weakness, right? And so that's why we don't make large decisions in the middle of the night, and that's why at 11 to 3, we don't want to make very large scale plans. And so here, this is where, we don't want to take a nap during the 3 to 7 p.m. because that would diminish our ability to actually sleep at night and have the liver accomplish its task, and have the lungs get into its deep sleep. And so again, we have to think about the kind of strength, the strongest part of the day, and we have to think about the weakest part of the day as well. And so kidneys, water retention, deep restoration, building bone marrow, things like this. Like this has to do with the ears. So this is kind of bringing down the level of input that you have throughout the day. So again, tasks are starting to, slow down. You're not putting a lot of demands and a lot of information into your mental and physical self. You might do some light exercise to kind of cool down for the day, but you're not going to do any bulk. You're not going to do the bulk of your work during this time of day, right? You're going to be doing more of those personal practices that you might do on a semi-regular basis to keep yourself comfortable, right? Because the opposite of fear is comfort. And so we want to, create a comfortable environment to kind of settle and nest for the end of the day. Okay. So 3 to 5 is the bladder, and then 5 to 7 is its Zang primary organ, the kidneys. Okay. Very, very important organ. If we come back to other systems of thought, we'll spend a lot more time talking about the kidneys. Okay. And then for the last couple, we get into some kind of the special organs. So we'll kind of go through these a little bit more smooth. So we get into the pericardium for the 7 to 9 p.m. Now the pericardium is the connective tissue that protects the heart. Okay, So in Chinese medicine, this is another organ all to its own. I like to refer to it as the King's Guard. It is kind of that protective organ that kind of takes care of the center of the body, right? And so you have this second fire phase of the day, right? And so with everything else, we only have one. We have the wood phase in the early morning, late night, and we have the metal phase. Then we have the earth. Then we have fire midday. Then we have water. So we have that fire-water balance in the middle of the day, the trading off of yin and yang energies. And then after water, we have another fire, right? And so this, I like to think about this as kind of like the evening fire. This is kind of the soft fire, the slow fire that burns long, right? And so while we have the energetic fire in the middle of the day, we have that kind of like that bulk, that purpose, that purposeful energy in the middle of the day with the heart and the small intestine. We have this big activity of fire. In the evening, we have the low fire, the one that, we put our stew on the fire to cook for the night, so we have a good breakfast. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that long-term replenishing kind of self-restoration, rehabilitation fire, right? This is kind of the self fire, the personal fire, right? And so the pericardium kicks that off. This has to do with blood and emotions, kind of restoring the balance and the smooth flow, right? As we get into the night, everything is kind of smoothing off. Everything is kind of trying to get you settled. The tide is coming down. Everything is getting soft and pristine and clean and clear. And all the organs from this point on are working on that replenishing aspect, right? Everything else maybe is more have to do with conditioning and kind of establishing, creating, transforming. Now we're getting into protection and preparation. Okay, so the pericardium starts that off 7 to 9. You want to keep things really, really soft. Hopefully this is when you're starting to pull away from all tasks, right? All hobbies, at the very least doing just reading, self-care, cleaning, anything that's kind of gives off an aspect of protection, something that's about care, something that is just for the softest parts of your practice. Like, this is a great time to meditate. Often we would have our meditation in the evening after dinner. After you digested, you've had an hour to digest, having a meditation practice, a light qigong practice, an evening walk, depending on the weather, I suppose. But just having something that just brings everything down. There's no disturbances and distractions. Hopefully screens are becoming less of the routine around this time of day. I think it's pretty often that, in today's life that becomes more prominent. But I think that can still be okay as long as there's kind of the 3-2-1 rule, is it? They have like the 3 hours before you go to sleep, no tasks, no work. 2 hours before you go to sleep, no meals. 1 hour before you go to sleep, no playing on screens, no activities. You have that last hour before you go to sleep of just cleaning yourself, preparing, rest, light meditation, maybe hanging out with your loved ones, having some of that just kind of quiet time, because your mind latches onto those patterns, right? If you have a phone within arm reach at every moment, if you have a job or a task that you can accomplish from home, it's very easy for your mind to be attached to that. It's like, oh, I can do something now. I can. There's an option here, and it'll keep you active and it'll latch on to that ability. And so if you make it a habit of kind of relinquishing these disturbances from your practice, from your daily practice, then at this point you'll get into a state where you'll easily fall asleep, and it'll be a lot more comfortable. So 7 to 9, you're getting kind of set up for that. Troubles of the heart, move away from, bringing in compassion, right? And actually the weakness of this, so if we talk about the opposite end of the spectrum in the early morning at the same period, 7 to 9, that's actually statistically the most common period of the day for people to have heart attacks, which for me, researching and thinking about this always seems kind of strange, because you'd think that it would be more late at night or in the afternoon when people are really active. But it's interesting that it's more often in the morning, when people wake up and you'd think they're at their most relaxed. But in Chinese medicine, the way they talk about this is because the pericardium is the protector of the heart, and its strongest energy is in the evening, right? And so its weakest energy is in the morning. And so it's kind of an interesting, I don't want to say coincidence or make that a justification to say this is why it's real, but it's kind of an interesting connection, right? And we can see that, there is some kind of balancing force in our body that kind of protects us and takes care of us. And it makes sense. Late at night, you're looking for a safe environment. You're looking to create some kind of comfort and safety, so that way when you rest, you're protected. And so the body also has that kind of tendency to kind of put up its walls and keep store and stay safe. So pericardium, protection in all senses of the word. Hopefully that's something that you can align yourself with during this time of day. So, okay, a couple more. Then we get into triple burner. Okay, so this is a pretty special organ. Triple burner is considered a Fu organ. It is hollow. It's not a real organ when we talk about the anatomical sense. With the others, they're all very easily identifiable, even though we talk about in the early stage that, that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about the connective influence and the communication across the entire internal self, the landscape of our body, and not just the one specific organ, that tissue. We're talking about everything in its sense. The triple burner is really interesting because it just subverts that entire discussion. It's not recognizable as a single place, and sometimes it's been referenced as the kind of viscera of the distinctions throughout the torso, throughout the trunk of the body. And so when we talk about triple burner, we are talking about 3 different districts, 3 different sections, right? We have an upper, a middle, and a lower, right? And the upper houses like the heart and the lungs. The middle, if I get this right, is the liver, the stomach, and the gallbladder. And then when we go down lower, then we have the intestines, the kidneys, and the bladder. And we have all the kind of waste management down here. And with the triple burner, the easiest way to think about it, from 9 to 11, this is another aspect of the fire phase, is that it is, burning. It is the kind of checking the water dispersion throughout the body, right? So what I like to think of it as is it's kind of like the end of the day, cleaning out the stoves, cleaning out the kind of passages, washing the streets, sweeping the sidewalks. It's kind of the kind of burner that just kind of cleans everything off at the end of the day, anything that's left over. And so if you've been using your furnace all day, if you're using this burner and you have that soot buildup, when you're done and it's still a little bit warm, you have that last little bit of the fire left in there. That's when you have to clean the plaque off. That's when you have to clean the gunk away. And that way, when you go to use it tomorrow, nothing will be stuck, because the fire is going to die in the middle of the night and it's going to go down. And when you wake up, you don't want things to be closed. You want things to be open. And so you have this kind of firing of these 3 burners in the torso, kind of cleansing off the, anything that's left over, right? That's a really simplified way of looking at it, but think of it as the upper burner in the upper part with the lungs and the heart. That is a mist. That is the softest energy. And the middle is more like a river. So it has to be clean, right? You don't want it to be stagnant. You don't want energy in the stomach and the liver. You don't want it to be blocked. You want it to be more robust and more tangible than what's in the lungs, right? Because we're talking more about like nutrients and digestion and blood. We're talking about these kind of things. You want it to be thicker, but you want it to be clean, like a stream, right? So you want it to be moving. You don't want it to be stagnant. Then when we talk about the deeper ones, we talk about the intestines and the bladder and the kidneys. Now we're talking about a swamp. We want it to be thick. We want it to be, full of a little bit more pressure, but having not necessarily a damp, kind of dankness to it, but definitely having some kind of like a more heavy energy to it, right? And so the triple burner would fire off in these 3 and warm the body, right? And so at this time of day, you should be warm. You should keep your torso warm. So, pajamas, t-shirt, wear something to keep the center of the body warm, because that's where your body will kind of return to and distribute energy out to the limbs, right? And so the triple burner kind of warms up the body and nests you so you can fall asleep. So this is when you're going to sleep, somewhere in this period. Hopefully 9 to 11 is the best period, if not earlier. So the metabolic, emotional, nervous, everything balancing off that water and heat level. Okay. Preparing for sleep. One of the ways to kind of set you up for this is taking a warm shower before this period, because taking a warm shower warms the body up, and that drop in temperature is kind of the signifier that happens after the triple burner. Like the triple burner warms up the body, and then that drop in temperature it kind of coincides with the ability to fall asleep. And so a lot of times taking a warm shower, hot shower in the evening, at some point it relaxes the muscles and it takes away that pressure, and that drop in temperature that'll happen naturally, or will happen synthetically in this case of taking a shower, will also coincide with that natural drop in temperature. And it's an easy way to kind of lull yourself to sleep, right? So like doing a hot foot bath as part of your pericardium, your self-protection, taking a warm shower, cleaning yourself, that sets you up for the triple burner to kind of relax everything down and clean off everything for the day. So triple burner is kind of a special one, but it is the softest time of the day of activity before we actually rest and fall asleep for the night. Okay. Then we get into our final one, the gallbladder, which is a curious organ. It is considered a Zang organ right now, but it is kind of a curious organ because it doesn't necessarily always want to be a Zang organ and be solid. It does create something. It creates bile, right? So it's one of the only ones that creates something, but it also doesn't want to store it. It wants to produce this and kind of always delegate it to another organ to help digestion or to help excretion like this. And so it also wants to be hollow in some senses. And so it's kind of a curious organ, and it makes sense because it is the organ that connects us from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. So it is that bridge from one day to the other. And so it's a little bit both, it's a little bit Zang, a little bit Fu, and it has this kind of aspect of yin and yang at work, right? And the gallbladder is the time of day where we release bile, where we repair the cells, where we build blood cells, and we get down to that kind of automatic nitty-gritty work, right? That sets you up for the balancing forces of the liver and the lungs that are going to take place next, right? So gallbladder is important for all your recovery. If we look at the liver being the wood phase, gallbladder is connected to that. It is the assistant to that. And because of that, you can think of this as the planting of the seeds, right? And so we have those kind of seeds being planted in the middle of the night, and that way they sprout and they grow throughout the day. And then they bloom in the middle of the day, they decay, they return to seeds, they harvest, they fall, and they get planted with care in the evening to grow anew every day. And so the gallbladder is kind of the switching from one day to the next. It is that recovery, that refreshment, and the assistant for all the other organs to accomplish their final task, if there's anything left over. So a really, really important one. It's very, very important to have this time be sleep, because this is when we're starting to make decisions. This is when planning is happening, when the mind is becoming more centered and more relaxed and capable for the next day's tasks. And because of that, late night eating damages the ability of the liver, because the kind of energy moves away from it and jumps forward into the spleen or the stomach and disrupts that flow of blood, of qi, of digestion, of water, of the energies of the body. And so gallbladder, 11 to 1, it's really important for us to be asleep. It's not going to be our deepest sleep, but it is the initial recovery that's beginning. So the fire is growing, the seed is being planted. So, yeah. That is the circadian clock. That is the daily energetic cycle. I think that, being aware of this and just kind of reminding yourself of it on a regular basis, and maybe you'll recognize some of those patterns. You'll recognize that you have an appetite late at night, or you wake up early in the morning, or it's hard for you to let go of tasks in the afternoon, but you find yourself being burned out and not having the energy you need to take care of yourself in the evening, right? We can see these patterns, and we can see the ways that we branch away from what is deemed natural. And because of that, it's a way for us not just to build our awareness of that, but hopefully to enact certain changes so that we can kind of balance that channel a little bit better. And I think if you pay attention to the feedback you get in the early morning, you read the face, you check your tongue, you drink water, check the dryness, you have a good meal in the morning, you plan your work for the best part of the day, you have something to rest and return yourself to kind of your own self practice in the afternoon, and you have that evening to relax and do something that is special to you, but also connects you to those around you. Because all of these emotions, all of these physical tendencies are reflections of the impact that our lifestyle, that our environment, that our diet, that our sleep is having on us. And so to ignore those is to ignore an aspect of ourselves, right? There's a really great concept that I read a while back. I don't remember where it's from, but we have this idea that, our ability to breathe is the organ of our lungs, right? But there's a way of looking at it that our lungs are not just in us. Our lungs also include the breath and the air around us. And for that reason, it also includes the trees, and it includes the life cycle of the forest. And our lungs are actually external from us, right? The actual physical change that happens is just the, one cog in that relationship. It's just one piece working. But without the air, without the environment, without the atmosphere, without the forest, and without that life cycle, this piece of machinery doesn't mean anything. And so I think that if we take those ideas and we apply them to our daily practice in some way, or our work, or our lifestyle or diet, we can see that it's not just an isolated experience. Our sleep is not just poor because our sleep was poor. Our sleep was bad because of, our sleep was bad because of all these other potential influences, right? And so hopefully with that, you can find some way to preempt those from becoming chronic issues. You have a way of understanding that feedback and turning it into a tool, and not just, something that happens that's external from your experience. We should pull ourselves away from that idea of, we don't have control, because that's just the way it is. There are things that we have the ability to change and adapt. And some of that will require a conscious effort. Some of that will require attention and awareness. This is one way that we can improve upon that, and hopefully add benefit and value to our lives. So, just as we attune ourselves to the seasons of the year, we should understand how that affects our well-being, right? We know this. It's intuitive. We can connect with it. I hope this becomes common knowledge, just another way of perceiving our natural selves, right? Because I think that these systems do have a lot that we can readily apply to our daily life. If we can incorporate just a fraction of this information, then we'll benefit 100-fold. So, By understanding ourselves and our environment, we can understand where we're going. We can understand our context and our purpose, and hopefully add drive and just overall positive growth to that experience. So I hope that you keep finding that balance, one moment, and of course, one cup of tea at a time. Cheers. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, also available wherever you get your podcasts. Support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon and get access to resources, classes, and more. Keep the conversation going with hashtag Talks-Unfiltered, or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. Links are in the description. I'll talk with you next time for another cup of tea.